Some whispered of strange sounds echoing through the graveyard at night. Others swore that the tombstones would sometimes shift as if moved by unseen hands. But there was one story, the darkest of them all, that no one dared to tell. That ghostly town, with its mist-covered streets and ancient stone paths, was a place long forgotten. The silence stretched endlessly, broken only by the howling wind and the distant, sorrowful wails of dogs. But the quietest, most unsettling part of the town was the cemetery, a place so old that no one could recall when it was first built. Even its name was a mystery. Years ago, a young girl named Jennifer fell into the river. Her mother, Zena, screamed for help, rushing into the icy waters, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't save her daughter. People who heard Jennifer's mother's desperate cries came running, but by the time they arrived, the girl had disappeared beneath the surface. Her final, heart-wrenching scream echoed across the town, leaving a scar on every soul who heard it. From that day on, Jennifer's mother was never the same. She became a shadow of herself, wandering aimlessly through the town. Each night she would go to the cemetery, lying on her daughter's grave, whispering to her as if she were still there. She stayed for hours, speaking softly, weeping, lost in grief. There was only one thing she had left of her daughter, a small doll, the doll which she loved a lot. With trembling hands, she tied it to her tombstone with a wire, letting it sway in the wind. The years passed. Zena grew old, and eventually she too passed away. But the headband remained, untouched by time, still fastened to the tombstone. Then the rumors began. People claimed that, on certain nights, they could hear the faint sound of a girl crying from the grave. When the wind blew through the cemetery, the doll would sway, tapping lightly against the stone. But sometimes, even when the air was deathly still, it would move, slowly, unnaturally, as if unseen fingers were clutching it. Many dismissed the stories as superstition, just another ghost tale whispered in the dark. But then came Marcos. He was 16 when he arrived in that town. He was bold, reckless, and above all, fearless. When he heard the town's stories about the crying grave, he only laughed. "These are just old wives' tales," he scoffed. "Ghosts don't exist." His friends warned him not to mock the dead, but Marcos was determined to prove them wrong. So one night he made a bold declaration. "I'll spend the entire night at the cemetery, right by the grave. Let's see if the ghosts dare show themselves to me." The others tried to dissuade him, but he wouldn't listen. He took a lantern and a thick coat and set off into the darkness, his confidence unshaken. The town watched from a distance as he entered the graveyard and sat beside Jennifer's tombstone. The doll still hung there, swaying gently in the cold night air. Then, silence, a deep, suffocating silence. Hours passed. The town slept. But just before dawn, a terrible scream shattered the stillness. "Let me go! Please let me go!" The voice was Marcos's. Then silence once more. At sunrise, his friends rushed to the cemetery. They found him sitting on the ground, his back pressed against the tombstone. His face was deathly pale, his eyes wide with terror, staring at something unseen. He trembled violently, unable to speak, unable to explain what had happened. All he could do was stare at the doll, which hung completely still, despite the wind howling around it. From that night on, he was never the same, and neither was the town. But Marcos wasn't speaking. His lips trembled, his breath shallow, his body frozen in place. His eyes, wide and unblinking, stared at something unseen, something far beyond the living world. Yet in his hand, he clutched something tightly. The doll. Not just any doll, the doll, the same one that had been tied to the tombstone for years. The friends who found him at the cemetery entrance recoiled in fear. Marcos's face was drained of color, his expression vacant, his fingers clenched so tightly around the doll that his knuckles had turned white. And yet, the doll was warm, too warm. The elders of the town wasted no time. They gathered the prayer circle, chanting verses and sprinkling blessed water upon him. But he remained unresponsive. His eyes flickered briefly, but he did not speak, did not move, did not acknowledge anyone. That night, as he lay in bed, feverish and moaning in his sleep, strange whispers escaped his lips. "Let me go. I'm choking." Family who sat beside him exchanged fearful glances, their skin crawling at the eerie words. Then came the third night, and with it, the voice. It began softly, a hushed whisper in the dead of night, seeping from the corners of his room. "Give me back my doll." The voice was small, fragile, like a child's. His parents pressed their ears against the door, barely breathing, their skin prickling with terror. The voice repeated, more insistent this time, carrying a hollow sadness that sent shivers down their spines. "Give me back my doll." For 3 days, Marcos remained in this state. He refused to eat, refused to drink. His body weakened, his face gaunt, his mind seemingly trapped in some unseen horror. And still the whispers did not stop. The graveyard had marked him, and it wasn't finished yet. For 3 nights, he remained motionless, his body stiff on the bed as if his very soul had been drained away. His skin had grown pale, his lips cracked, his breath shallow. Then, on the 4th morning, something changed. He suddenly gasped, sucking in air like a drowning man breaking through the surface. His fingers twitched, his eyelids fluttered, and then, slowly, he looked around. The people who had gathered in his room held their breath. But Marcos was still clutching the doll. His grip hadn't loosened, not even in his unconscious state. His knuckles were pale, his fingers locked around it like an iron vice. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, shaking. "I saw her in the cemetery that night." A cold wave passed through the room. People exchanged wary glances. The youngers stiffened. No one dared to ask, yet Marcos continued, his wide, haunted eyes staring at nothing. A girl, her hair was wet, her clothes covered in clay. Silence suffocated the air. "She bullied me." The words sent chills down the spines of everyone present. What did he mean? Who was she? His father shifted nervously, some clutching their prayer beads. His grandmothers murmured under their breath, whispering sacred verses. Then he spoke again, his final sentence. She said, "You have to return the doll." A single shudder ran through the room. "Return the doll?" The meaning of those words unsettled everyone. The elders began to murmur prayers under their breath. The younger men looked at one another, fear flashing in their eyes. No one understood what it meant to be touched by that doll. Only Marcos knew. And even he couldn't put into words the terror he had experienced. Because every time he tightened his fingers around that doll, every time he felt its warmth pulsing against his skin, he knew. The presence inside it was stronger than anything he had encountered in the graveyard that night. Marcos had made his decision. That night, he would return the doll to the grave. His friends insisted on accompanying him, unwilling to let him face the unknown alone again. They walked side by side, their footsteps barely making a sound on the narrow dirt path leading to the cemetery. The night air was thick, the sky heavy with the weight of unseen eyes. As they neared the grave, the wind began to howl, a long, mournful wail that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Then Marcos said, "I feel her. She is here." A sudden tremor ran through his fingers. The doll, still clutched tightly in his hand, shuddered as if something unseen was trying to pry it away. A force, not entirely human, was pulling at it. His friends turned to him, voice uneasy. "Marcos, are you sure about this?" But Marcos wasn't listening. His wide eyes were locked on a single point in the graveyard. Just ahead in front of the old tombstone, the ground stirred. Then, a hand emerged from the earth. It was frail, fingers twisted unnaturally, the nails worn down as if they had clawed desperately at the dirt. The skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over the knuckles. And then the hand moved. Slowly it lifted into the air, its trembling fingers reaching for him. The wind died. A voice, hollow and distant, whispered through the silence, "Give it back." The sound was sharp, cutting through the night like a frozen blade. Marcos's breath hitched as a cold shiver ran down his spine. His hair stood on end. His legs refused to move, frozen in place by the sheer terror gripping his chest. He knew that voice. It was the same voice that had whispered in his room, the same voice that had haunted his dreams. A hand lunged forward. Marcos screamed. In blind panic, he threw the doll onto the ground. The cemetery shook. A deep guttural moan rose from the graves. a chorus of voices mourning in unison. The earth trembled beneath their feet, and then, crack, the tombstones began to split. Fractures crawled across the stone like jagged veins, breaking apart as if the cemetery itself had been awakened from a centuries-long slumber. And then, silence. The very moment the doll landed before the tombstone, the shaking ceased. Marcos and friends gasped for breath, their bodies trembling from the ordeal. They turned, ready to flee, ready to escape this nightmare. But they didn't move. They stood still, their faces drained of color. One of his friends moved and said, "We have to go," Marcos shouted, but his friend remained rooted to the spot. Their lips trembled. Their eyes, wide with terror, were fixed on something beyond Marcos's shoulder. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, one of Marcos's friends spoke. "Guys, there's someone behind us." They screamed, in blind panic. And then, silence. The very moment the doll landed before the tombstone, the shaking ceased. Marcos shouted, "Run, run!" They ran as fast as they could. The girl stood atop the tombstone. Her damp, stringy hair clung to her pale, almost translucent skin. Her dress, once white, was now soaked and covered in scattered flowers, as if she had been lying in a garden for centuries. She clutched the doll tightly in her hand, and then she smiled. "I got my doll back, but it's not enough." And sing-song whisper carried on the wind, echoing in the hollow depths of the night.